welcome to this CADA lunchtime event. Nice to see lots of you online here. Lovely to see you all. My name's Charles Muswhite. I'm Professor in Psychology at Aberystwyth University and co-director of the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research. So lots of you probably know about the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research, or CADA as we call it already. We're funded by Healthcare Research Wales to bring together people doing research on ageing and in gerontology from loads of different backgrounds and disciplines. And we're very keen on making sure that our research is linked to policy and practice and has real life impact, and hopefully can make things better for us all as we age. Along with the Older People's Commissioner, I think it would be great if we could make Wales the place to age well in across Europe, but also taking best practice from the rest of the world as well. So it's great to be able to have people like Gill Toms work with us on and we have other people as well working on stuff so that we can help our research be relevant to the issues in the real world. And make a difference to people's lives. So today we're looking at short breaks, and we know how important they are to people's lives. We know that they're still not quite embedded in policy and practice in ways in which we think might make a huge difference, although we've had massive improvements in that over the last few years. And I think Gill, you're today looking at social return on investment as well as part of the process, which again, we know if we want to change people's attitudes and opinions about how important short breaks are for people, then that is a crucial tool in the journey to making a difference. So I'm going to leave it over to you. You can introduce yourself, Gill, and take it away, and I'll hang around here and listen to how it comes along and get involved where I can, and shout if you need anything. But over to you, and welcome everyone.
Thank you, Charles. So for those who don't know me, my name's Gill Toms and I'm based at Bangor University, and I'll just share my screen and introduce what I'm talking about today. So now hopefully you're seeing a presenting screen. So thank you again to CADA for providing us this opportunity in their seminar series to present our project to you today. I just want to start with a few acknowledgements about the project. The study we're talking about today, or I'm talking about today, is funded by the Welsh Government through Health and Care Research Wales, and it involves researchers from Bangor University who are based in the Developing Evidence in Rich Practice programme, the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research, and the Centre for Health Economics and Medicines Evaluation. And we have two project partners who are PXS UK Limited and Shared Lives Plus. So as Charles said, today we're talking about short breaks. And just to start off, when I use the term short break, I wonder what comes into your mind. If you're willing to, maybe you could put in the chat your initial thoughts on what a short break is. Did perhaps an image like the one on the slide come into your mind, or were you thinking of something very different when you heard the term short break? I'll just pause for a minute to see whether one or two people are willing to share in the chat what they thought of. Thank you very much. So we've used a definition of a short break provided by Shared Care Scotland, and I'm going to pause for a minute so you can just read through the definition for yourself. So as you've read, most things that might have come into your head when you thought of the term short break are considered to be examples of short break. And what I want to highlight today is that day support can be considered to be a form of short break. And our project has looked at a Shared Lives day support service as an example of how this type of short break might work and what it might contribute. So in the presentation today, I'm going to put the project into context and briefly explain why researching short breaks is important. I'll then provide an overview of Trio Day support, our exemplars short break. I'll talk through the SROI evaluation and share some of our preliminary findings to date. And I'll conclude with what we think might be some initial recommendations that can be taken from what we've learned. But I'm very keen to hear your ideas and reflections on this as well. So many people provide unpaid care. For instance, there's 3.7 million workers in England and Wales who provide regular care to a friend or family member in addition to their paid employment. And I pulled out this statistic about amongst the many I could have cited because it highlights the ripple effects of providing unpaid care on employment, the economy, and other aspects of society. Unfortunately, many unpaid carers report negative mental and physical health impacts as a consequence of providing care, as well as the impact on the unpaid carer themselves. These negative impacts matter because poor unpaid carer well-being can lead to more people with support needs entering residential care and more pressure on public services. Short breaks are one way to support unpaid carers. They can support unpaid carer well-being and, importantly, the well-being of the person with support needs too. However, we need to explore alternative forms of short break because although wanted and very important to many people, traditional respite services like day centre services or overnight stays in a residential home, they do not always meet people's preferences or their desired outcomes. For instance, people living with dementia accessing day services and residential respite can report negative outcomes. At the moment, there's little research exploring what outcomes community-based short breaks might achieve. And this was one of the pieces of rationale for the current project. So let me describe what our exemplar short break service is. It's called Trio, and Trio operates in North Wales, and it's based on the shared lives model, which has a very different approach to traditional day centre services. Trio provides support to people living with mild to moderate dementia and their unpaid carers. And in the service, people who receive the service, people with mild to moderate dementia, are called citizens. So in Trio, a small group of people, citizens who have similar interests, are matched with a paid companion who enjoys the same activities. And they meet as a group on a weekly basis in the home of the companion. And they access their local community for trips and activities. What makes Trio innovative is that citizens in Trio are matched based on their interests as well as their needs. And this means that citizens can make new friends. Support is provided within their local community. Citizens remain part of their community, and the support is provided outside of an institutional environment. And then each session, a companion supports just 2 or 3 individuals, so it's easier to provide person-centred support. And then finally, the same companion is providing this support each week, so that kind of relationships can really be established and maintained over a long period of time. As I think I said, Trio is provided in North Wales, but there are similar services operating in several parts of the UK now. So turning to the study itself, we evaluated Trio using a social return on investment approach. And there are 6 stages in conducting SROI evaluation, which we undertook in a 3-phase project. In phase 1, we undertook a rapid evidence review. And in phase 2, we conducted interviews with Trio stakeholders. And we used these phases to map the likely outcomes of Trio, and this helped us to develop a logic model for the Trio service. Then in phase 3, we quantified the outcomes detailed in the logic model using questionnaires. The outcomes, once quantified, were converted into financial values, and we calculated the additional social value created for each stakeholder group. Due to time today, I'm going to focus mainly on the logic model we created for the service and the preliminary sense of what we found overall. But first, I want to talk through the methods for the rapid evidence review and the interview study very briefly. The interview study is particularly important as the value of the SROI method is not so much in its number outputs. So please don't feel too shortchanged that I'm not showing number outputs today. But its value instead is in the story that explains the significance behind the numbers, behind the findings. And this is found in the qualitative information. So first of all, the rapid evidence review, where the aim was to draft an initial logic model for TRIO based on the wider literature. As I said, TRIO is based on the shared lives model, so we reasoned we could get a good idea about how TRIO might work and what outcomes might be expected by looking at the wider literature on shared lives. Shared life services are numerous. They don't just provide day support, they can also provide long-term care, overnight stays, and reablement. They also provide support to people with a variety of care and support needs. So our review question was, what outcomes are reported for stakeholders of the shared lives model? And what are the reported mechanisms of outcome? And as you see, we screened quite a high number of records and included 16 papers and reports. And just to mention, that did include some grey literature reports as well as peer-reviewed published papers. It's also probably relevant to note that when we conducted a quality appraisal of our included literature, we judged that just over half of our reported studies had a high risk of bias. But taking the findings from the literature, we used narrative synthesis to blend these into the first draft of the logic model. We then interviewed TRIO stakeholders, and the purpose of doing this was to refine our logic model so that our shared lives logic model became specific for the TRIO service. So our interviews with stakeholders explored what outcomes people had experienced or witnessed and what they thought had brought these about. Due to the health protection coronavirus Wales restrictions, interviews took place online or on the telephone. The context the project ran in is reflected in our small sample size. It was difficult for us to encourage citizens to take part on top of all the other challenges they were facing, and professionals outside of TRIO, our wider stakeholders, were under too much pressure to participate. The interviews we were able to conduct were rich, but we fully acknowledge that the limited contribution of citizens at this stage of the project needs to be taken into account when we interpret the overall findings. Again, using a form of analysis called framework analysis, we synthesized our learning from the interviews into a logic model. And then using a kind of compare and contrast, we refined our two logic models into a final version. So I've mentioned the term logic model quite a few times now, and one or two people might be wondering what a logic model actually is. And I just want to pause and explain this because logic models are an important part of SROI evaluations. So logic models are a visual accessible summary of how a short break creates change and what change is created. They can show and help explain the relationship between short break inputs, activities, and outcomes, and they're often used for planning, evaluation, and information sharing. Just so I can have an idea of people's experience with logic models, I think Kim or Charlie is going to kindly launch a poll, which is on the presenting screen now. So I'll just move that out of the way. And so the question is, have you created a logic model as part of a project or a piece of service development? I'll just pause for a minute so that people can answer. And Charlie and Kim, when the results have settled down, could I just ask you to share? Excellent. So we've got 33% who have used logic models in the past, but as 47% haven't and 20% not sure. So what I hope will happen over the next 2 slides as I talk through our logic model, hopefully they will start to make some sense. So I've split our final logic model for TRIO over 2 slides, and just for ease of presentation, I've produced these slides separately in Welsh, and these will be accessible after the presentation. So on this slide, I'm detailing the mechanisms that seem to operate in TRIO and the context that TRIO is operating in. So these are what the literature and interviews suggest contribute to the positive outcomes in TRIO. Now, as you scan through the slide, I think for many people here, these will all look, especially in the inputs, activities and outputs, they'll all look like fairly routine standard things we all know about, and that would be fully endorsed in a lot of the literature about being important things that contribute to positive outcomes. One thing that sits behind this logic model, though, is the establishment of a truly triadic caring relationship between unpaid carers, citizens, and the companions, the paid companions who are providing the support. And I just want to provide one example of what I mean by this to help hopefully bring that a bit to life. So if you look in the outputs column and you look at choice and control, citizens in TRIO chose what they wanted to do during their time with TRIO each week. And paid carers also felt they had some control. They were consulted about the activities, and safe choices had been negotiated with them. The paid companions additionally also felt they had a measure of control. They had some autonomy in how they supported citizens each week, so they could respond flexibly to the needs of the situation. This slide moves on to show the reported outcomes from TRIO. Again, our short-term and medium-term outcomes are primarily drawn from the interview data, but the findings in our rapid evidence review would fully endorse these outcomes. The suggested long-term outcomes are drawn from the literature. Our interviewees did not tend to discuss these longer-term outcomes, probably because the people we interviewed were mainly currently involved with TRIO rather than looking back on it from a long period of time. Because of the triadic nature of the TRIO service, we found that interviewees suggested that all members of the triad experienced positive outcomes. And step 1 of the SROI analysis then was to quantify some of these key outcomes that have been reported for each member of the caring triad, focusing on the short-term and medium-term outcomes as we had rapid evidence review and interview data supporting these outcomes. So let's turn to phase 3, and I'm guessing, again, some people might be wondering what SROI evaluation is. So again, Kim or Charlie, could you please launch the next quick poll just to see about how much knowledge people have about SROI? And again, I'll just ask Kim or Charlie, sorry, I think it's Kim, isn't it, to just show the poll once the responses settle down. Okay, thank you. Great, so 13% have undertaken an SROI, 31% know a little, 38% have heard, and 13% don't know. So for those who have already taken, apologies for telling you some of the things you might already know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through, perhaps in more detail than we normally would in a seminar series session, about what we've actually done. And that's because, to our knowledge, this is the first time that in a published piece of research, anyway, that SROI has been used to explore the outcomes the additional benefits of community-based short breaks. And I'm hoping as we go through, we can just highlight some of the challenges and areas of deliberation we faced. But because I'm going to talk through what we've done in more detail, for those where this is of less interest, I will at the end just summarise the basic principle of the evaluation again at the end before going on to the findings. So there'll be kind of two opportunities to get the gist of what we've done. So for those with less knowledge and experience, just very basically, SRI is a form of economic analysis that examines the social value of an intervention. Basically, explores whether the intervention creates more value than it costs. If you just look at traditional cost savings, e.g. less nights in a residential care home bed, you might overlook less tangible benefits like improved well-being or experiencing better quality of life. SRI tries to capture and put a financial value on these less tangible benefits. And the calculations in SRI work out for each pound invested in an intervention, how much social value is generated. And it's based on approaches in health economics that explore how the costs and benefits of interventions balance. But hopefully some of that will start to make more sense as I talk you through what we've done. So the first step for us was to design questionnaires to capture the key outcomes identified for each member of the triad. When designing these questionnaires, we did draw on existing measures, such as the flourishing scale, but we tweaked some of the wording and added our own bespoke questions so that we really did try and capture the outcomes which people said were important in TRIO. On this slide, you can see an example question from the questionnaire for unpaid carers. For the citizen questionnaire, we designed things slightly differently, and we just asked citizens about how much outcome they had experienced since attending TRIO. We were concerned that if we asked before and after questions for citizens, their answers were likely to be confounded by the onset of their dementia, because for most of these individuals, pre-TRIO would equate to before their diagnosis of dementia. This is a variation to the normal method used in SRI, which is just why I want to highlight it. I think it's probably also, I should have mentioned, you can in SRI do a baseline measure and a follow-up measure. TRIO was already an existing, very established service with a low churn in members when this project arose. So it wasn't possible for us to use a baseline and follow-up approach to study the service. The assignment of financial outcomes or the financial values in an SRI, once you've got your outcomes, can seem somewhat of a dark art. So again, I'm going to attempt to be transparent about what we've actually done. So first of all, we quantified the outcome leading to better well-being using the questionnaires. We then found another outcome with a known financial value that theoretically and based on research has a similar effect on well-being. And then we used this financial proxy to calculate how financially valuable our outcome was. So for example, just working through the pictures on the slide, unpaid carers having peace of mind can contribute to well-being in a similar way to someone regularly practicing meditation or yoga. So we looked at the cost it would amount for someone to access regular weekly sessions of meditation over the period of a year. And we used the whole of this figure if on the unpaid on the questionnaire, unpaid carers told us they had experienced 100% more peace of mind after engaging with TRIO than they had experienced before engaging with TRIO. The next few slides, again, are presented separately in English and Welsh for ease of reading. And the next 3 slides detail the outcomes we're planning to capture and the types of questions we've used to quantify the outcome and the financial proxy used. And you'll see there are some gaps on the slide, and I'll talk through these as I go. So you'll see in our final plan, we're planning to quantify 4 outcomes using multiple questions to capture the various dimensions of these outcomes. And you'll see, hopefully, what looks like a logical financial proxy we're using in each case. You'll notice well-being is in red at the bottom. In our original thinking, we had intended to quantify a more general well-being outcome based on our interview findings. And I'll come back in a minute to why we haven't pursued that plan, because it's a methodological point of note. So for unpaid carers, you'll see that we're planning to quantify 3 outcomes, and in 2 cases we've used multiple questions again to try and capture the range of dimensions within the outcome. And again, hopefully the financial proxy looks realistic. The caring relationship is something where we're still trying to pin down the financial proxy at the moment. We have 3 options, and we're consulting as a research team about which option is the right one to go with, because we can put a reasonable justification for the use of each one, which is just my way on this slide of highlighting that there is always some subjective interpretation on what proxies can be used for which outcomes, and different research teams might meet different conclusions from their deliberations over which financial proxy to use. For companions, the paid companions, we quantified 2 outcomes. And just to clarify, this is social value additional to the pay that companions receive. And again, to acknowledge this approach is unusual in SROI to look for additional value generated for paid staff. But our hypothesis was that working as a shared lives carer, or a trio companion in this case, is very different from other types of care work. Citizens and unpaid carers can almost become part of the companion's family. And it seemed important, therefore, just to explore whether there might be additional non-pay related benefits for these workers. So the decision about what counts as more of an outcome can also be debated in SROI, and we've used thresholds that have been used in other similar SROI evaluations. So going back to our example question, if the after rating was 1 step higher than the before rating, regardless of where it was on the scale, we added 20% of the social value figure into the calculation. The further the distance travelled, the more of the social value figure was added to the calculation. On the citizen questionnaire, we started including value if their rating was some of the time or above. So just to come back into that pitfall, we nearly fell into ourselves. As I said, we had originally thought about including a broad outcome of better well-being into our analysis based on an interview findings. However, of course, feeling more confident and being less isolated, more socially connected, are both in themselves facets of people having better well-being. And it would have been overcounting or double counting, if you prefer, to include both of these facets of well-being plus an overall well-being outcome. As when selecting proxies, deciding what can and cannot be included in the SRI calculation can be open to subjective interpretation. So the goal is always to be open to scrutiny and to provide a clear rationale for each decision. And if your rationale starts to sound unconvincing, being open to amend your plans a little like us. And just to reiterate, that's why today in this presentation, I'm sharing more of our methodology than might be normal in a seminar series session, so that we are being open to scrutiny and that we're trying to be transparent in our decision-making as possible. So in the questionnaires, we asked 3 further questions to determine how each outcome related to TRIO. On the slide, the first question is about attribution, how much the respondent thought the outcome was due to TRIO. The second question is about dead weight. How much outcome the respondent thought they would experience anyway. And the third question is about displacement. Activities the respondent had stopped due to TRIO that had been contributing to the outcome. These questions helped ensure we were attributing the right amount of outcome to TRIO. Thinking back to that unpaid carers having peace of mind example, obviously there may have been other things contributing to unpaid carers having peace of mind, and it would have been overclaiming if we just automatically attributed all improvements in peace of mind to TRIO. So based on the responses selected to these questions, the amount of social value added to the calculation was reduced. There were two further areas we applied reductions. So as is standard in SROI, we reduced the amount of outcome expected after the first year, as outcomes are known to reduce over time. And then we also explored what we expected to happen if the individual stopped attending TRIO. And we based this reduction on values that have been applied in similar SRI evaluations in the past. So you might be glad to know this is where I pause and just sum up our methods, attempting to sum them up in just one slide as a kind of takeaway message about our method. So the cake on this slide represents an outcome. The whole cake is when 100% of the outcome is present. However, no intervention delivers 100% of the outcome all the time for every individual. So you need to cut away slices of the cake until it matches the amount of outcome you have and what can be confidently attributed to the intervention. So first, we remove slices so that the cake matched the size of the outcome reported. We then took out more slices to discount the amount of outcome not attributed to TRIO, the amount of outcome attributed to other things, and the amount of outcome missed out on. We then took out further slices, as we know the outcome will reduce over time, and we considered what would happen if the individual stopped engaging with the intervention. So hopefully you'll agree that the amount we're actually eventually adding into our calculation to see what additional value has been created has been substantially reduced from its starting point, and hopefully this will increase confidence that we're not trying to overclaim the benefits created by the service. So the calculation of the SRI ratio is usually the straightforward bit, but this ratio is only meaningful if the previous steps have been done rigorously. Obviously, any ratio has a degree of imprecision, so a range of sensitivity analyses are conducted to explore what happens if various inputs and outcomes are changed. For instance, it's not inconceivable that the cost of providing a service like TRIO will increase at some point. Additionally, we undertook the evaluation during the pandemic. The service had to alter its model as group activities could not be as easily provided at certain times, and it was not always possible to meet inside, though it must be noted that TRIO did continue to operate during the pandemic, whereas other services weren't able to. However, even in spite of this changed operating environment might have reduced the outcomes experienced, and service collected data and our interviews also suggested that outcomes reduced during this period. So when the normal operating model of the service is fully reinstated and some time has elapsed, outcomes might actually increase. So what are our preliminary results saying? Well, what I can share today is who has so far completed our questionnaires, which we fully acknowledge is a small sample. I'll just pull out two details about our sample in particular. First of all, just noting the companions. In SRI, rather than the end figure, the most important thing is your coverage of the population. TRIO is currently operating with 7 companions, so actually having 4 companions complete the questionnaires is a reasonable coverage of our population. But on the other hand, there's currently 18 unpaid carers connected to the TRIO service. So obviously, in particular, unpaid carer population or sample is very small here. And also for full transparency, transparency, we did have some missing data within the unpaid carer questionnaire returns. Because we're conducting a pilot analysis to see how feasible the method is and what results might be found if a larger study was overtaken, we are still considering the data from unpaid carers, and we're considering, based on the strong interview data we had for unpaid carers, what would happen if more carers had completed the questionnaire in a similar way to the unpaid carers who had completed, which we can be confident they are likely to a certain extent based on the interview data we had from unpaid carers. What we haven't tried to do is provide a combined rating at the moment because of the weakness, especially in the unpaid carer data. So just to recap, the SROI ratio indicates how much social value is created from each pound invested. So if £1 was the cost of providing the service and £1 was the value generated, there would be no additional value. And any social value exceeding £1 once the costs are removed would indicate additional value. Because as I've talked through, it's been very clear that this is an ongoing analysis. I'm not going to risk sharing our final ratios today because these are still under consideration and in some cases still being calculated. What I can say of the gist of our findings is that TRIO seems to be a relatively low cost short break to provide, and it does seem to generate more value than it costs to provide, especially or at least when people are currently engaged in the service, which you would expect. I wouldn't expect short breaks to necessarily provide lasting benefit when people disengage from that type of short break. It seems that most of this value accrues for citizens, but we need to interpret that very cautiously given the weakness in our unpaid carer data. Where TRIO seems to create most value for citizens is helping them have a sense of control in improving their confidence and increasing their social connection. Contrary to our hypothesis, companions do not seem to receive additional value at the moment that's generated additional value over the cost of providing the service. But what they do endorse is feeling more connected since working as a companion. And even though that might not end up showing as additional value generated, I think it's still an area that might be worth considering and exploring in more detail in future research, given the problems we know there are in social care in terms of staff retention and staff turnover, because it's still saying something about some of the benefits that people receive from working within a service like TRIO. In terms of sensitivity, we can be fairly confident that as TRIO fully resumes its usual model and time elapses, we do think we will find more outcomes generated, and that's likely to be across all of our stakeholder groups. But obviously, if service costs go up in the future, then the additional value will reduce somewhat. So yesterday we held a knowledge exchange event with some of our participants and other stakeholders interested in this area of short break. This event helped sense check our preliminary findings, and based on preliminary findings, think about potential recommendations for policy and practice, and gave us a good opportunity to explore people's ideas for future research in the area of short breaks. However, I'm very keen that others also engage with us in this sense checking work and in co-producing our recommendations. So in a minute, I'll come off screen share, and I'd just like you to invite you to join small groups in breakout rooms for just a few moments and just have an opportunity to talk through any of these 3 points that resonate for you. And Kim, in a second, when I come off screen share, will put these questions in the chat, so you'll have them to hand in the breakout rooms. So based on the preliminary findings and the logic model, which I've been able to share, does anything strike you about what I've been able to say about our findings and our logic model today? based on these preliminary findings, are there recommendations you think that follow for policy and or practice? And then what future research would you like to see concerning short breaks? Hopefully when we come back together, one or two people will be happy to share some ideas with me, either by coming off mute or in the chat. And then I'll just conclude literally with 4 minutes on sharing some of the recommendations and ideas for future research that came both out of our knowledge exchange event yesterday and our own thinking as a research team. Brilliant. I think we're all back. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Now I can see some faces. So is there anyone who's willing to share just very briefly an idea or a thought they had about the findings, anything resonated, or maybe ideas for future research in the area of short breaks? If you don't feel brave to come off mute, maybe someone would like to share in the chat.
Well, the first thing that we agreed, I think, was that we would look forward to this method being used with a larger sample, because we realise it's a pilot and you're testing the methodology, which is extremely useful in itself. But we would look forward to there being a larger sample. Yeah,
no, we would very much like that to be the case. Thank you, Vanessa. Charles, you have your hand up.
Yeah, we were just saying how complex the decisions are behind it all. Don't envy your position in having to work out all of those things, but just how difficult, how do you come up with some kind of value for community, for example, or, there might be set rates for day centres and things like that, but even that varies within things. So we know that it's not, it's probably not as objective as it looks, but then what else do you do? It's better than not having it at all. So just having how you go about that process was really useful and interesting, but it's got to be remembered that, that it is a process. So perhaps co-development with policy and practice and with older people themselves about how you come up with the values for different parts and what those parts are is probably crucial.
Yeah, no, fantastic idea about co-developing more that part of the study. Thank you. I should probably say there is a list of financial values that are usually used in SROI, and they're seen as the most reliable figures when you can use them, and they're the hacked social value calculator. And we have used those values whenever possible, but in our case it wasn't always possible, and that's where some of the deliberation came in, then deciding what would be the right value to use.
Steve made a point as well about using this methodology different with other kinds of respite.
Yes, and I think that would be very possible to do, especially if it was a new service. I think this method would be wonderful to see it used where you've got the ability to do a baseline and then a follow-up, which would be more in keeping with the kind of robust form of SRI, if I can put it that way, which wasn't possible in this case. So hopefully this is a good example of how you can still use the method in event circumstances. Especially if you were building a new service, a new respite service, a new short break, it would be nice to plan to use this method from the beginning, so you could do a baseline and then follow up. Thank you, Vanessa. So
it might be quite useful for you to actually gain a database of what is actually being used as a short break across Pan Wales, because we all do things slightly differently, and there are things that work better in our localities than in others. What I shared in the group was we tried to emulate the Trio service within Wrexham. We could not recruit to it. We had shared lives as the provider, so the same provider was delivering in Wrexham. They were with us for in excess of 2 years, and at the very end of the programme we had 2 carers left. Now really that just didn't work. Whereas we've had another enterprise coming called Community Catalyst, who are based up in Yorkshire, in Harrogate, and they've been developing micro enterprises for us, so sole trader carers and providers of short breaks as well just form part of that. And we've had a massive success on that, where, you know, they are recruiting really, really highly. It's not solving our problem within our dom care market, but it is really helping us to maintain that balance that we need. And the Regional Collaborative for North Wales are actually undertaking an evaluation for me on the service, so that I'm not biased in any way, shape or form. But, you know, it's a case of looking at also the digital opportunities that are available to provide a short break, because it is based on what you said earlier, it's different for everybody. And I've mentioned the fact that we've got the Rita devices here in Wrexham that we're utilising quite strongly, and they can provide a meaningful activity for an individual, but also a break for the unpaid carer. And it's evaluating all of these different options, and it's a case of, it should be a smorgasbord really of offer, so that we're not narrowing the field. Because the problem with research like this, and this is, it'll end up being a positive, I promise, the negative on this is people grab on it and go, oh, Trio, that's it, that's the solution then. Unless we talk about the broader picture of opportunities and the successes for all of it, people will just focus on that research that you've done and go, it's great, so that's what we need, but it won't necessarily translate to the location that it's being put into.
I think the point just Steve's making is about the having a sort of a picture of the whole picture really of all the things that are going on, and possibly any evaluations that are done. I wonder if that will come as a result of the unpaid carer strategy, because there's been quite talk about first of all a carers register, hasn't there, and then a census, but also I know I was arguing for a database of all the services everywhere, so that you could tell at any point what was happening in any particular area, and you could make comparisons as well. So I think Steve's got a good point there about having the whole picture.
Yeah. No,
it's
definitely.
Very easy nowadays with databases, isn't it?
It is. Let me just come back to screen share, because I think our own recommendations, actually, when I talk through them, in which I'm only going to take 2 minutes to do actually touch on some of the points you've just raised. So these are, as I said, our thoughts as a research team, and also thoughts coming out of the knowledge exchange event we did yesterday. But when we look at policy and the idea of thinking about promoting regular short breaks as part of a normal routine and commissioning community-based short breaks, we are very much, Steve, talking about as part of a wider set of options. It's not about just commissioning this type of service. We'd entirely agree with you. There needs to be a range of options that will suit different people, because as I said right at the beginning, traditional respite services, day centres are important to many people and provide many people with good outcomes, just not everyone. So it's having those choices available. The practice recommendation around providing relational care will not be a surprise to anyone here, but our findings particularly focus in short breaks to maybe thinking more about triadic caring relationships and how to nurture them in short breaks, because historically I think triadic caring relationships haven't had a lot of consideration in previous short break research. And then just in terms of future research, one question which is based purely on our own very homogeneous sample, and actually the fact when we reviewed the literature, homogeneous samples were the order of the day. Using the SROI method, we probably need to do more exploration about whether community-based support enhances the well-being of people from other cultures and ethnicities. But our second question, again, I think touches on Vanessa and Steve's points, again, about the outcomes of different forms of short break and comparing them. So you can start to gain more of a picture over who might work for, what might work for whom. SROI is not a good way of doing comparative research. It's not the right method to use to do that, though obviously you can do SROIs on different types of short break and see what you find, but the comparison bit isn't part of the SROI method. But there's many other types of research, obviously, other methods you can use for that more comparative research, which I do think is like the ultimate aim in this. in this field of research, because it's that kind of comparative information that will help in terms of future decision making and policy and commissioning. So just when you get my slides, you'll have a list of the references I've referred to, and just to acknowledge where my images have come from. And it's only left for me to say Diolch yn fawr am wrando heddiw, and these are just the main contacts in the research team. Alongside myself, there's Dr. Louise Prendergast and Diane Seddon, and do feel free, if you'd like to get in touch with any one of us by email after the presentation. So again, let me come off screen share. And I think I've managed to come in at 1 minute under time.
Perfect timing, Jill. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation, and nice to have a very brief discussion in it. You know, we haven't got a lot of time when we've only got an hour for these things, but nice to see and talk to some real people online. So yeah, well done. That was great, and really important work that you're doing there. And thanks everyone for attending. There's probably a feedback sheet somewhere, is there, Kim, for people to feedback on the event, either coming to you on email or some similar method. Do keep in touch with us at the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research for more events like this, and to get involved in research that we do as well. So yeah, great to see you all, and thank you very much. Thanks again, Jill and Diane and the team.
Thank you.